thank you so much to the university for giving me this opportunity. I'm very happy to be with you all, and it's a great pleasure to be talking with you about this. I hope we have an interesting discussion. So my topic is about fighting social and economic inequalities at a time of global disorder. So of course, the first question is, what is this global disorder and how does it relate to the order that was there before? And what is the order that is being disrupted? Should we mourn it? Should we celebrate it? How do we respond to that? So I know that this is a time when most people in the world are confused, worried, insecure, maybe even frightened about the instability, about the chaos that has been unleashed by the US Trump administration, that people increasingly don't really know what direction to take, what's going to happen next in terms of trade wars, technology wars, global investment, capital flows, everything. And that a large part of the rules of the global economy that people had begun to take for granted are now simply being thrown overboard, upended, and no longer valid. This obviously creates consternation. People are not sure how to respond. But I think it's important for us, if we want to understand what is going on, to take a step back and understand how we got here in the first place. What is this global economic order, after all? And when did it start? How did it get created? Because it didn't just drop from heaven. It wasn't just something that emerged fully formed. It was something that was created. And essentially, it was created after the Second World War, in the middle of the 20th century. This, remember, it's not, again, created out of nothing. It's created from a world that was already divided into rich countries, less rich, or poor countries. It was already a global division of labor that had been created over the past century or more. But this order was something that emerged out of the wreckage of the Second World War. And that wreckage is something that was not just because of the war, it was because before that, in the interwar period between the First and Second World Wars, there was massive economic instability, very similar to what we're experiencing today. There was global capital flows going rapidly from one country to another. There was trade protectionism by different countries, forming groups or blocks and competing against one another. There were competitive exchange rate devaluations, countries allowing their currencies to depreciate to get an advantage over a trading partner. There was a lot of instability of transport because wars already erupting in some places were making a lot of earlier transport routes unviable. This all happened already in the 1920s, the 1930s, until, of course, the Second World War created an even bigger disruption in the global economy. Coming out of that Second World War, I think everybody across the world realized that this is too dangerous a situation, that these kinds of massive instabilities are terrible for every country and for people in every country, all kinds of people, rich and poor. And so they must be controlled in different ways. And that is why in that period, immediately after the Second World War, we saw the emergence of many of the basic institutions that define our world today. The United Nations. Okay, there was an attempt earlier, the League of Nations in the interwar period, which didn't work because the US opposed it. Woodrow Wilson was the person who wanted it, the president of the US, but the rest of the US Congress basically didn't let it happen. By the Second World War, I think every country realized that you have to ensure a minimum of peace. You have to have a system of dialogue. You have to have a system of cooperation. You have to have countries coming together to decide on some minimal issues that everyone can agree on, so that in fact, everyone can move forward in their own different ways, but at least without constant threat of very desperate and very destabilizing wars. So the United Nations was formed, and after that, many different United Nations institutions were formed as well, which now we all know about, whether it is the Food and Agriculture Organization, the Trade Organization, a whole range of things that the UN set up in different areas, in different sectors. But this was also the period of the Bretton Woods institutions. The Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 created the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the World Bank, which were meant to provide the economic underpinning for what everybody thought would be a cooperative global peace. So it was recognized that economic concerns can actually generate the conditions for war. And therefore, the IMF and the World Bank were created. The IMF was supposed to give us financial stability. It was supposed to ensure that any country that faced a big balance of payments crunch could approach the IMF and get given the necessary money that it needed, okay, to tide over that crisis. Because countries, they're not like companies. They can't go to the local bank or the national bank. Countries, governments, they have to actually approach an international authority. So the IMF was meant to be that international authority. The World Bank was supposed to assist development. Originally, it was called the Bank for Reconstruction and Development because the countries that had lost the Second World War, and in fact, much of Europe was already devastated. So the World Bank was supposed to provide the financing to reconstruct where there had been war devastation and to enable the development of the poor countries that still had not even embarked on serious development projects, economic transformation projects. This was all under the broader hegemony of the United States. So the one thing that was very clear after the Second World War is that the US was the global hegemon. It was economically the global hegemon because it was the most powerful country. It accounted for 1/3 of global output and half of global trade. That is how important it was because, Europe had been devastated by the Second World War. So it was hugely important in size, but also, therefore, the institutions that were created gave a massive importance to the United States. The US and Europe together, they basically controlled both institutions. And even when and they just acted together. They decided together what had to happen. But in any case, even if they didn't act together, the US had effectively a veto. Because the way these institutions were constructed, the voting rights determined what each country's say in these institutions was. And you couldn't make any major decisions unless you got 85% of the vote. So guess which country has 16% of the vote? It's the United States. So the United States has an effective veto. Had it from way back in 1948 onwards till today, it has an effective veto on any major decision of the IMF and the World Bank. So effectively, these institutions also became arms of US foreign policy. But of course, the US was also very important in its own right because it became a dollar reserve currency. The world became an economy that relied on the US dollar as the reserve currency. And that in turn meant that every country basically had to deal in dollars, trade in dollars, get capital flows in dollars. And that gave the United States huge power, extreme power in terms of being able to run deficits on its own because everybody would accept US dollars. And so it didn't have to have a current account surplus. It could run, in fact, it began by first generating capital account surpluses. It used to spend money outside, but increasingly it actually started running current account deficits. And it could do that because every other country is willing to accept the dollar. You can just print money, right? You can actually just expand and print money, and other countries will accept it. This allowed the US to have a lot of, shall we say, lack of discipline. Okay, what today all of us, the rest of the world, we all know about fiscal discipline because we're always reminded about it. And capital markets will punish us if we don't have fiscal discipline. Okay, but the United States didn't have that problem, except when it really overextended. So, for example, in the 1960s, there was a massive increase in military spending. The US was extending itself in many places, but particularly in the Vietnam War. And it really effectively just printed money to enable that big military expansion in the Vietnam War. This is in the 1960s, right? And it makes the rest of the world pay because the rest of the world is just accepting those dollars, which are printed out of nothing. You know, that it's supposed to be linked to gold, but in fact, there's no link anymore. And everyone knows it, but everybody accepts it. Until, in fact, capital markets, which were not very well developed at the time, but still they began to get concerned that the US dollar was supposed to be linked to gold. It was supposed to be that 1 ounce of gold gives you $35. But who knows whether they had enough gold in their reserves in Fort Knox and all the other places where they kept gold. In fact, the guess was that they didn't. And in fact, it turns out that they didn't actually, because in 1971, President Nixon, who was the president at the time, he announced that the dollar is no longer going to be linked to gold. It will be whatever value the markets decide. And suddenly, therefore, there was again this period of chaos, uncertainty. Oh my God, what just happened? So everybody who was taking dollars, thinking that, okay, it's worth this much, now suddenly the dollar value collapses because Nixon has announced that it's no longer worth the equivalent in gold. And so you're holding money that is worth much less than you thought it was. And this is something that has basically been done to the rest of the world by the US. Okay, the rest of the countries have no say in this. So it was like a default, really, right? It's basically they're telling you, well, you think you owe us money, that we owe you money, but in fact, we're going to owe you less money because it's less, the dollar is worth less now. It was a period, the 1970s, I lived through. It'll give you an idea of how old I am. But I lived through the 1970s, and I remember the insecurities, the instabilities, the chaos, the confusion, a lot of it. Again, all created by the US. And at that time, people were talking about the loss of US economic hegemony. At that time, again, the threat was seen to come from the East, but a very different country, Japan. Okay. At that time, Japan had experienced a post-war miracle. It had massively increased its growth rate, its exports. It was very competitive. Its exports were entering all the Western countries, cheap but better quality. And the US, Europe, all very worried about Japan becoming this very major competitor. Fast forward a little bit, we got 2 decades of instability, the 70s and the 80s. Well, mostly the 70s, which were also accompanied by inflation and lower investment. Okay, the uncertainties made investors wary, they kept waiting, and so that lowered investment. And there was inflation because the price of the dollar, the value of the dollar had fallen, and all the other currencies as well. So therefore, prices went up. In the 1980s, you had Ronald Reagan come to power in the US and Margaret Thatcher come to power in England, in the United Kingdom. And both of them imposed a policy of what is called monetarism. That's the idea that you have to control money supply, and that will force inflation to come down. Now, that's officially what they say is the theory, but the reality is something different. What they really do is that it's seen as a way of bashing trade unions. Because inflation was rising, workers were demanding higher wages, capitalists kept their profits margins up, and so prices kept rising. But if you can force workers not to demand higher wages, even when their prices are going up, In other words, if you can force workers to take a cut in their real wages, then they will suffer, but inflation will come down. And that is really what both Reagan and Thatcher did. They used monetary policy as one of the tools to suppress spending of people, because very high interest rates makes it harder to borrow to buy things, makes housing mortgages more expensive, and makes all other loans more expensive. It also makes capitalists less willing to invest, and that also reduces spending. But also, they bashed the unions. The coal miners' strike in England was very ruthlessly suppressed by Mrs. Thatcher, and a bunch of other strikes in the US were very, very roughly suppressed by Ronald Reagan. And so you got a change in that class balance, okay? And then they also did various other things. They reduced tax rates for the rich. Reagan, interestingly, he didn't cut public spending. He just shifted it to military spending. So actually, that period of the 80s, ordinary people's spending fell, but military spending went up massively. And that made the US economy actually, grow more rapidly than it had grown before because of the public military spending, not because of anything that they were doing for the rest of the economy. And that in turn meant that the countries in the developing world that had borrowed, Brazil is a big example of that period, that had borrowed in the 1970s when they were being given money because of oil price hikes, etc. The oil petrodollars were available. They got it cheap. The interest rate was lower than the rate of inflation. So they said, well, why not borrow? So many countries in Latin America, a few countries in Asia, a few countries in Africa, they all borrowed. For the government, the private sector borrowed much more in dollar terms. Suddenly, Reagan comes in, tightens monetary policy, makes interest rates rise, and issues much more US government debt because they are spending more. So all the capital flies out of these countries. Brazil was one of the big ones that had a big debt crisis in the 1980s. Your parents may have told you about it. So by 1982, 1983, a bunch of countries is experiencing severe debt crisis. In Latin America, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, Chile were the big ones, but there were about 12 countries that had very serious debt crisis. In Asia, it was mainly South Korea, but a few others as well. 4 countries in Africa were very badly hit, Nigeria and some others. And that debt crisis effectively pushed back development in these countries by at least a decade. In fact, the period after that is called the lost decade. Okay. But what that period did was to bring upfront the role of finance. So remember that in the earlier period, the post-war period, we had the UN, we had the Bretton Woods institutions, but in fundamental ways, we hadn't changed the colonial division of labor. Most developing countries were still exporting primary products and importing manufactured goods. The high technology stuff was all still in the global north. The power, the relative power of the rich economies was greater than ever. Okay, so it wasn't explicitly colonial, but it was still broadly the old colonial division of labor. So, despite the positives of that system, there were many problems, constraints, and difficulties, especially for the developing world. And so there was a lot of resentment. The group of poor countries, what today we call the low and middle income countries or the developing countries, that they formed a group. They called themselves G77, the group of 77 that want to change the global economic order. There was a demand for a new international economic order. And that became louder and louder. There was the UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, was set up as a response to the demands of these countries, saying, we are not satisfied with these rules of the game. and we demand a change. Unfortunately, the change that happened actually made the rules of the game even worse. It kind of cemented those rules. So what changed? The big change was the growing role of finance. So from the late 1980s, but really from the 1990s, we saw a growing domination of finance. Now, this wasn't an accident. This is something that happened because of state policy. It was created by government policies. So this role of finance happened because governments in the North deregulated finance, the United States, Japan, Europe, etc. And then they increasingly encouraged, persuaded, or forced countries in the South, in the global South, to deregulate finance. And so all countries became involved much more, or shall not all, most countries became much more closely involved in global financial markets. And that means that you could attract finance when the times were good, when interest rates were low, when there was a lot of money in the system. But then it could leave as well, right? It could leave whenever things got bad in your own country or in the region, or if things got more attractive in some other region. So remember that this is still a world where there is that broad hierarchy of countries. And that hierarchy got expressed also in currency hierarchies. So developing countries today, we're still very much at the bottom of the currency hierarchies. In that ladder, we are the less powerful ones. Anything that happens in the world, even if it's nothing to do with us, affects us badly, causes capital to fly from our countries, creates a devaluation of our currency. Okay? And this is something that persists till date, which is why we are the countries that face massive debt problems, even though our public debt to GDP ratios are much lower than those of the rich countries. The average of rich country debt to their GDP is 110%. The average for poor countries, the lowest income countries, is only 40%. The average for middle income countries, it's around 50%. So we are actually more disciplined fiscally, but we are the ones who get the debt problems because capital moves away from us at any point. If there's something good happening somewhere else, or if there's something bad happening somewhere else, either way, we tend to lose out. Now, this is a situation which, as I said, Japan was the big threat in the 70s. We find that today's big threat, of course, is China, right? And how did that happen? How did China emerge as such a significant threat? Now, remember that China, unlike most of us developed countries, it didn't get, first of all, it was allowed in a sense to develop without access to global markets in quite the same way. Yeah, until the end of the 20th century, most of its development was oriented towards its own internal market. So it had a lot of industry, state-owned enterprises, public investment, all of that. And it's a large economy, right? It was more than 1 billion people already, even then. But from the turn of the century, basically since it joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, China was able to access global markets. It was able to access the US market, European market, Japanese market in ways that it could not sell earlier. And the thing about China is that when they decided we are going to modernize and we're going to bring in private capital and all that, they did this in a very controlled and strict way. They didn't follow the neoliberal policies all of us followed. No, we did what we were told. We were told you have to open up your trade, open up capital flows, deregulate finance, privatize your industries. They didn't do all of that. They privatized some industries, yes, but they strictly controlled capital flows and they controlled trade flows to quite an extent, but towards an export-oriented expansion. And remember, they have a very large population, and it was equally distributed, more or less, at the beginning of this process in the 1980s. So when they embark on manufacturing, let's say, refrigerators or cars or two-wheelers or anything. They have a huge domestic market, right? Lots and lots, I mean, millions and millions of purchases. And that gives them economies of scale, which makes them cheaper. And then when they export, they're so much cheaper than everyone else because they're able to use new technology, but with economies of scale, which is why once they had access to these global markets, they became the global leaders in manufacturing for a whole range of industries. It begins with the light industries, you know, clothes, textiles, shoes, toys. Toys became a big one. Toys is still very big, but it spread to everything. And for about 2 decades, they were not just the largest growing exporter of the world, the fastest growing exporter of the world, but they soon became the largest exporter. By the 2010s, they were the largest global exporter in the world, and mostly manufactured goods. And so they began to be seen then as a country that is really important. They did this by allowing foreign capital in, but on very strict terms. So the terms were that, I mean, at least 30 different permissions that everybody needs. You know how in our countries, we are always told we have to have ease of doing business. Well, they didn't have ease of doing business. You had to get 30 permissions to be able to operate in China. But even so, multinational companies were queuing up at the doors because they knew it was a huge market. Everybody wanted to be part of that market. And then when they realized that they also had very good infrastructure, because they were spending a lot of public money on infrastructure, and they had very skilled workers, because they were spending a lot on education as well. But those workers were very cheap. So then they were very happy. Multinational companies were very happy to come in and actually use China as a base for exporting. So a very significant part of that massive expansion in the Chinese economy, that export-led expansion, was because they did bring in multinationals, but with very tight conditions. So among the conditions was that any multinational company that comes in has to have a local joint partner. You have to have a Chinese company as your partner. It has to be a joint venture. So the multinational will own 51%, the Chinese partner will own 49%. Now, in that process, it means the technology automatically gets transferred. If you're both running the company, you can't tell the Chinese owners that we will not tell you how we're making this thing, right? The technology gets shared. And so through that process, they accessed a lot of modern technology. We could have done the same in India, we didn't. You could have done the same in Brazil. You didn't. We did not do what was obvious and should have been done by all of us. So we did not get the same technologies. But already by 2010, they were realizing that, look, we're growing so fast, we're getting so much export that there's going to be a backlash. They're going to say, no, you're not allowed to keep exporting the same way, because they had seen Japan go through this as well. So they began to put an emphasis on developing their own technology, spending a lot on R&D, spending a lot on encouraging scientists who were in the US and elsewhere to come back to China and set up their own labs and do all of that. And that process, of course, now it's really accelerated because of the clear opposition in the US to any Chinese technological advance. Now, the process of China becoming this dominant exporter, it wasn't only China. There were other Southeast Asian countries, Malaysia, Korea, uh, Indonesia to some extent. There were other countries that were exporting more manufactures. But it basically meant that the manufacturing working class in both US and Europe was losing out, and relatively speaking, was not getting the same kinds of incomes that they had been getting earlier. Meanwhile, profit shares were rising in every country in the world. It's so funny because, workers in the north think that they are losing and profit shares are rising because of workers in the south. But in fact, profit shares are rising in all countries, including in the global south, including in Brazil, in India, in Egypt, in every country. Profit shares are rising, workers' shares are falling. Because capital has much more bargaining power than the workers in these countries. Essentially, that meant that workers in the US and elsewhere, they were not just experiencing much greater economic fragility, but they also saw the inequality. They saw the extremely rich get even richer. And even though they were all trained to think that everybody can become rich, they realized that that's not true. That in fact, the prospects for many of them are very dim, that the next generation will not do as well as they have done. And in fact, the same is true in Europe. The working class felt more and more alienated, felt that they are not gaining from this. But instead of blaming their rich and their capitalists, they blamed workers in the rest of the world. They blamed us. They blamed the Chinese, the Indians, the Brazilians, the Mexicans, and they blamed them because of migration or because they were doing things more cheaply. And that's the reason why you get Trump. That's the reason why you get the rise of the right wing in Europe. That's the kind of response that has been generated. And the reason that the right wing has got so dominant is because even when you had kind of leftist governments in power or center left governments in power, they broadly followed the same neoliberal playbook. They didn't change that playbook. They just tried to soften it up a bit. They said, okay, we'll give you more welfare. We'll give you more, cash transfers. We'll give you more food access. We'll help you out in those ways. We won't change that basic structure. So people lost faith in them. And then you get these economic nationalists come in, like Trump, but like Orban in Hungary, like Mr. Modi in India, etc., who basically promise that they're going to disrupt. They identify the problem, but their solution is something very problematic, right? It's not the right solution, but they identify the problem. And because they identify the problem, that's why they get the support. That's why people want to see that whole system just being disrupted. So this is the context in which we are getting this broader phenomenon of today, what we call the chaos in the global economic order. And this is a chaos brought about by Trump too, by Trump's second government, in which he has, of course, brought in in one level, crazy system of tariffs, but another level, if you think of it as a bargaining stance, uh, using trade as a weapon openly. It's not the case that the US didn't use trade as a weapon, but the US now uses trade as a weapon openly, okay? And says, I will not give you access to my markets until you do the following things. And the following things are not always trade related. They're not always that you have to lower your tariffs against the US. No, there are things like you have to change your patent laws, make your intellectual property rules tighter. You have to give more investment freedom to US companies. You have to give special subsidies to US. You have to give us access to your land, your mineral resources. That's the kind of thing they're asking for. They're not necessarily asking for only trade concessions. The instrument is trade, and the weapon is trade, but the desire is to reassert US domination in the global economy using the US market as the means. There are problems with this, and it won't work. Why? Because the US today, it's only 15% of global trade. And for most countries, Mexico is an outlier, Vietnam is an outlier, but for most countries, the US share of its exports is only about 15%. So you can actually think of doing without it if necessary. You can redirect and divert. But also because once the US dollar has also been weaponized, which was not with Trump, it was with Biden, right? What did President Biden do? He said, we are going to put sanctions not just on Iran and Venezuela and Cuba. We're going to put sanctions on Russia because of the war in Ukraine. We are going to freeze the Russian assets in the US. We're going to stop Russia from using the SWIFT, which is a way of exchanging money across countries. SWIFT is a platform for money exchange. We're going to stop Russia using that. We're going to try and prevent other countries from trading with Russia. Now, you do all that, then you realize that at any time, if the US government decides they don't like you, they can do all that to you as well. So most countries are starting to move a little bit away from the dollar because it's too dangerous. You just never know. Most countries are thinking we have to diversify trade. We can't just keep relying on the US. This happened before Trump. Imagine what is happening now after Trump. Whatever countries may say about the concessions they are willing to make, and some weaker countries are making a lot of concessions, but many are not. They are all thinking of a plan B. They are all thinking of ways out. So I would put it to you that yes, this is definitely a time of global disorder, but it's a time that gives us opportunities. There are opportunities to be had because of the disorder, because all those rules of the game, which were constraining for us, the investment rules, the debt rules, the WTO rules, they actually constrained us. They didn't allow us to do independent, autonomous, or industrialization. Those are really, they've been blown out of the water. They're not relevant anymore. If countries can show imagination, this is a time when we can use this chaos to our own advantage. But we cannot do it alone. We have to do it in coalitions. We have to form groups and coalitions that enable us to actually do the kinds of things we want to do in terms of industrialize our own countries, bring people out of poverty, provide sustainable patterns of growth that do not destroy the planet, do not destroy nature, do not destroy the ecology, generate more employment for our people. It's not impossible, but it means we have to move away from an export-led, debt-driven strategy of economic development. That export-led, debt-driven strategy is something that was thrust upon us by the global economic order of the past. So what Trump is doing is very brutal and cruel. But if it forces countries out of that pattern, then it's good, because that was not a healthy pattern for us. Very few countries have really succeeded on the basis of export-led growth. China is an example, but China had massive controls on the rest of its economy, just like Vietnam, the same way. So other countries, the rest of us, we did not really gain from that export-led growth. We certainly have not gained from a debt-driven pattern. So India and Brazil, we are two of the few countries that, having experienced a debt crisis, we tried to make sure we don't go through an external debt crisis again. Yeah. Many, many other countries, they go through these cycles over and over again. Every 20 years, a huge debt crisis. And that really means a terrible destruction for your own people. We don't need to do that. We don't need to have an obsession with exports. We need exports, but mainly so we can import more ourselves. And we need to import the things that we need to industrialize our country, to move to higher value-added activities. And we can do that if we cooperate with one another. In coalitions, it could be regional, it could be across regions, it could be even north with south. But we cannot do it if we just go back to the earlier strategies. So how do we fight social and economic inequalities? We fight it by changing our pattern and our system of development. We fight it by addressing redistribution, by taxing the extremely wealthy and the multinationals who currently get away with no taxes. We do it by changing regulations that allow companies and very rich people to benefit from crazy things like intellectual property or knowledge, which they have no right to control and claim ownership over. And we do this by protecting our nature and our environment, and by trying to think of the ways that science gives us to develop without damaging the planet. So this is actually a time of possibilities. It's not only a time of chaos, or rather, The chaos itself can generate possibilities. Let me stop here, and I'd be very happy to take questions.